All right, so we're in the second chapter of Tanya. We are at the inserts, the inset, the gloss, Hagaha. I mentioned throughout Tanya there are a number of these glosses, notes that are inserted into the text, which my understanding of it at any rate is that these are not fundamental to the flow of the explanation of what he's talking about over here, but it's a place where the Alter Rebbe will address an issue that somewhat tangentially comes up from what he's talking about, but certainly contributes to our understanding of it. Before I get to this, I wanted to briefly touch on, we'll recap a little bit of what we read so far, and then and that will include another gloss that the Alter Rebbe inserts in chapter 35. So we'll get to that in a while. So this chapter is dedicated to explaining and developing the idea of the divine soul. And the Alter Rebbe referred to the metaphor of a child or children, that the Jewish people in the Torah are referred to as God's children. First of all, one example he gives is when Moshe spoke to Pharaoh in Egypt, and he told Pharaoh that God says, Israel is my firstborn son. And another example is from Deuteronomy, where Moshe instructs the people and tells them, you are children to Hashem your God, and therefore you shouldn't make gashes in yourself, and you shouldn't, you should maintain yourself with a certain dignity that is appropriate for children of God. And what this term is meant to imply, certainly the subject of many commentaries, that what is the connotation of being a child to God. So at a very basic level, it would mean somebody that has maybe a special relationship, special patronage from God. But in Tanya and in Chassidus in general, the Alter Rebbe, the later Rebbes, they try to get deeper into the metaphors. In other words, not to take them for granted. If the metaphor that was chosen was that of a child, of a son, then the specific relationship between a child and a father, and that's the fact that it's the father in this case is relevant, is the closest, the most illustrative of what the relationship between the Jewish soul and God is, at least for the purposes of what the Alter Rebbe is discussing here. So he said that the child derives from the father's brain, that the beginning of the coming into existence of the child begins with impulses in the father's brain. And that idea of the connection to the brain of the father is what is most pertinent here, as the Alter Rebbe then unpacks the metaphor and says, likewise, the soul of every Jewish person derives from God's thought and God's wisdom. So I just wanted to comment for a moment on this idea of deriving from God's wisdom. So we spoke about the idea of the 10 sefirot, which we'll loosely call the 10 divine attributes, even though attributes is not quite the There is no real translation of the term sfirot. There are all kinds of ideas that are linked to it, and so it's a technical term that the more we learn about them, the more we understand what that word is meant. So I'm saying it's a special word that's used only in this context. I mean, sfira as a word exists in other contexts, right? For example, we have the counting of the Omer. It's called sfirat Omer, the count. The Omer is also lisaper means to relate, to tell a story. It could be like a sefer, a book. It could be related to the word sapir, which is a kind of radiant stone. Haircut is also tisforet, right? Tistaper is to get a haircut. So I'm saying when it's used in Kabbalah to talk about what in other contexts might be called God's attributes, sometimes like in the Talmud we'll talk about God's midot, midah, which also is kind of used somewhat loosely because midah literally means a measure. But the Kabbalists will use the term sfirot, and this also relates to what we're going to be talking about today in the topic of anthropomorphism, which is the question of how these sfirot relate to God himself. So I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We spoke about how the first of these 10 sfirot is the sefirah of Chokhmah, of wisdom. And wisdom is only a very loose translation of it. I'll soon give a more specific definition of Chokhmah, of God's wisdom. When we talk about God's wisdom, Kabbalistically, we're talking about the sfira of Chokhmah, the sfira of wisdom, in the world of Atzilut. So we spoke about how there are 4 worlds, generally speaking. Each one can be divided into many worlds, subworlds within it. The 3 lower worlds are called Bria, creation, Yetzirah, formation, and Asiyah, which is, I think, completion would be a good translation of that. Those worlds are considered created, whereas Atzilut is called emanated, which is not created. It's as it were like an extension of God. It's considered a world that is entirely divine. So the sfirot that are within the created worlds are considered created entities. They are somehow distinct from God in a way that the sfirot in the world of Atzilut, in the world of emanation, are not distinct. Atzilut is a term. It can mean nobility, but those who translated philosophy into Hebrew used it to mean emanation. Emanation is the idea that God's existence, there are certain realities that result just from God existing, without any further action on God's part. So if we think of creation is like an initiative. God says, you know what? I want something else. I'm gonna make it. As there are certain things, certain truths, realities that exist because God exists. Let's say one way of thinking about this is to say God being perfect, so God also possesses wisdom. So the existence of this sphera, of this entity of divine wisdom, is a in some ways even an automatic consequence of God's existence. This is in very broad terms, and this is I'm not saying that this is exactly how it's understood by the Alter Rebbe or by the Arizal or by Shekordavero, the specific habits and how they look at it. But that's the idea of emanation as being not requiring any specific action, not requiring any specific movement outside of oneself, but just by virtue of God's existing, these things exist. So when we talk about God's attributes, when we talk about things that relate to God, we say it's God's wisdom or God's mercy, God's kindness. We're talking about the corresponding sphira in the world of Atzilut, which is considered a world that is entirely divine. In chapter 35, the Alter Rebbe defines this sphira of Chokhmah, and he says that Chokhmah is the awareness that God, that Hu Levadohu, that He is alone, and there is none outside of Him. That is and he says that is the level of Chokhmah. So, in a sense, the soul deriving from Chokhmah means that at the core of the soul is this awareness that He is alone and there's none outside of Him. Okay, but we will come back to all of that. Let us read a little bit in Tanya, and hopefully try to at least begin talking about this Haggadah, this gloss. So we're actually going to start a couple lines before the gloss. So I'm going to start by the word kach, so too. So where the Alter Rebbe begins to unpack the metaphor of Israel being called children to God. In the original pagination of Tanya, this is on page 6, side A. So kach kaviyachol, so too, as it were, nishmat kol ish Yisrael, the soul of every Jewish individual, nimshecha mimachshavto v'chochmato yitbarach, derives from God's thought and from God's wisdom, as we mentioned previously from the Midrash that it says that Israel arose in God's thought, but specifically in God's wisdom. And what is the characteristic of God's wisdom? Says the Alter Rebbe, the Ihu Chakim Vela B'Chachma Yediyah. This is a quote from Tikkunei Zohar. It's said by many people on Friday afternoon before Mincha, before the afternoon prayers. There's a passage called Patach Eliyahu, which is a passage from the Tikkunei Zohar. It's like a prayer, praise by Elijah the prophet. And among other things, he says over there that there he says it in the second person you, but here he says that he is, why you are wise, but not with a known wisdom. In other words, we have to say that God possesses wisdom. To say otherwise would to say that God lacks intelligence in some way, which he can't and won't say. But it's not with a known wisdom, meaning that we cannot hope to know what wisdom means for God by reference to our experience of wisdom. Usually, or always, whenever we try to understand something, we use ourselves as a reference point. I know how I experience something, and that's how I'm understanding, even when it comes to other human beings. Certainly comes to God, and to some extent, we don't have a choice in the matter. The question about how the praises that we say during the prayers sound to ourselves and to God, we compare it to how it would sound if somebody said that to us, or if we said it to another human being. So we're comparing it to our own experience, and so the Zohar emphasizes here that he is wise, but not with a known wisdom, not with the wisdom that we can comprehend, because it's nothing like our wisdom. So let's pause here for a moment. We're going to be talking a lot about the Rambam today. And the Rambam is famous for his negative theology. The way the Rambam puts it is that all of the attributes, characteristics that we ascribe to God, we do so not to say that God has those characteristics, but to negate that he doesn't lack those characteristics. So if we say that God is wise, we're not saying something positive about God. The most that we could say is that God does not lack wisdom. God does not lack power. God does not lack benevolence or mercy. But we cannot say what God is, because God is a completely different sort of existence than our existence, and so we have no reference point to compare it to. So this line that he is wise but not with the known wisdom resonates with this idea of negative theology. We're saying that God is wise, but we're hastening to clarify that it's not with a known wisdom. It's not with a kind of wisdom that we can know. It's not with a kind of wisdom that we understand. And so, what is the point of saying that he's wise in that case? What is the meaning of calling him wise? I'm going to fill in words over here, but that would seem to be what he's saying, at least at a first glance reading, is that God does not lack wisdom. We're saying that God does not lack wisdom. Okay, in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe puts this differently and closer to what you were saying, Neil, which is that when we talk about God possessing various characteristics, we're saying that the fact that these characteristics exist within us comes from him. So he being the source of wisdom or mercy or whatever other attribute we might ascribe to him, means that whatever mercy exists out there, whatever wisdom exists out there, it comes from him. It doesn't come from anywhere else. He's the source of it, so we ascribe it to him, even though we can't positively say that about him. But it's a slightly different statement in that case. The question is, what are we saying when we say that God has wisdom? If we say that God, I'm smart, and God is smarter, that's limiting God, right? That's saying that he's basically a human being, a greater human being. He knows a lot more than me. He cares a lot more than me. He's capable of doing a lot more than me. So he's basically a bigger version of me, us, right? That's in some ways saying that God has a body. We don't necessarily have to be saying that God has an actual body in that case, but we are saying that God can be described in some way, right? I can, with whatever the limits of my intellect are, if I think about somebody who's, a lot smarter than me, I can talk about how they're very smart without implying that I'm as smart as them. I don't have to be as smart as somebody else to talk about how smart they are. So, but let's work it the other way. If I have something, where did I get it from? I can only get it from God. God is the source of everything. So if I have some kind of attribute, let's stick to positive attributes for now. Let's not talk about let's not talk about failings. You're right, but that's gonna muddy the waters too much. But certainly positive attributes like wisdom, or attributes like mercy. If I have it, then God must, in some sense, possess it as well, or else where did I get it from? So I'm not gonna try to explain or to describe what it means for God to possess these qualities, and how these qualities exactly relate to Him, but I can't deny their existence within Him because they exist in the world. So that is, I think, basically the way that the Alter Rebbe explains it in Tanya. It's not, at least to my understanding, not exactly what the Rambam is saying. The Rambam, I think, tries to distance God much more from any kind of description, and that might be a little too positive for him. The Rambam says he's not unwise. He's not lacking in wisdom. He's not lacking in mercy, because that would be a failing. That would be a flaw. So we don't ascribe or assume any kind of flaw in God, right? If a human being who lacks mercy is flawed, how much more so if we thought that God lacked mercy? So God forbid to say that. But what does it mean for God to have mercy? What does that mean? Is not something that we can possibly talk about, because to define it would be to limit it. Is everything that God does considered merciful? No, I don't think so. It displays different attributes at different times, and the classic binary pairing in the Talmud is that between the attribute of judgment and the attribute of mercy. So judgment would say, a person should get what they deserve. Mercy would say that despite the fact that a person may not be deserving, they should still, be treated with additional compassion. So I don't, no, not necessarily is everything God does merciful. I mean, maybe at some esoteric level, which then would have to be explained. Okay, but let's make sure we don't lose sight of the thread. What you said, Michael, actually brings up another related way of looking at this, also from the Rambam. The Talmud says that we are meant to emulate God, and it gives examples. It says, just as God is merciful, so too you should be merciful. Just as God does acts of kindness, so you should do acts of kindness. And so the Rambam says that the reason why the Torah describes God in these ways, calling Him loving, merciful, forgiving, etc., is to be an example for us to follow. So one way of thinking about that is just to say that we're not actually saying about God that He is X, Y, or Z. We're not making a positive statement about Him, but it's more for us, like you were saying before, right? It's in order that we should be able to have an example of how to lead a godly life. So the Torah, talks about God in anthropomorphic ways, or more like a human experience ways, in order for us to be able to have an example, know the example to follow. Okay, let's come back to the Tanya. So the Alter Rebbe, and this is important, that Michael, you're talking about the limits of language, and that's absolutely true. And in fact, is one explanation for the difficulty in understanding Kabbalistic texts, because we're trying to put into words things that can't be put into words, and so we have to say things that are not. Let's say they're not linearly comprehensible. It's not like a philosophic proposition or something that you can just, right. It's poetic or yeah. And so in Chabad Hasidus, there is a lot of the work is about bridging that, on the one hand, something that is ineffable, can't be articulated, and yet finding a way to say it in a meaningful way, in a comprehensible way, and in a way that at the same time doesn't diminish the transcendence of what is being said. So we're going to study, and you're going to, decide for yourself over time how successful you think the Alter Rebbe is at doing that. But in this case, right over here, the Alter Rebbe quoted a line from the Zohar. He said, "God is wise, but not with no wisdom," and he immediately follows it up with an explanatory clause. Elahu v'chachmato echad. Rather, he and his wisdom are one. U'kamosha katav harambam, as Maimonides writes. So the Alter Rebbe here is saying that if we read, and this is not about so much negative theology, although it's related, but a related idea of the Rambam, that will help us understand what this means, that God is wise, but not with a known wisdom. And he's pointing here to the fundamental difference between God's wisdom and our wisdom, and that being that he is one, is united with his wisdom. And that's in contrast to our relationship to our wisdom, to our experience of our wisdom. And that is why God's wisdom is so indescribable. Because so long as the basic mechanics of how it works would be similar to ours, we could, at some level, even a pale comparison, but at least at some level, we could understand it, we could describe it. But since it's a difference of kind, not of degree, our wisdom not being one with us, and God being one with his wisdom, that's why we have no reference point. We have no way of describing it because that's completely outside our experience. We don't know what that is. And he's going to talk about what the Rambam writes. So we're first going to, I'll first talk about what the Rambam says, looking at the Rambam's own words, and then we'll come back to the Tanya, where he kind of summarizes and puts it together. But I think it's worthwhile to quote the Rambam at some length over here. So in the laws of the foundations of the Torah, Hilchot Yesodei Torah, where the Rambam is explaining basic concepts in understanding of God as Jews that relate to basic mitzvot of the Torah, such as the belief in God or the knowledge of God, and the affirmation of God's oneness in the Shema. So he says as follows. He says, God, the Holy One, blessed be He, is aware of his true existence, and he knows it as it is. He knows it accurately, something that we're not capable of. God does not know with knowledge that is outside of himself, the way that we know. We and our minds and our knowledge are not one. But the Creator, his mind and his life are one from every side, from every angle, and in every manner of unity. Were God to be alive with life, or to know with knowledge that was distinct from him, then there would be multiple gods. There would be him, there would be his life, there would be his knowledge. That is not the case. Rather, he is one from every side and angle and every manner of unity. And this is the part that is quoted here in Tanya. Thus you say, he is the one that knows, he is that which is known, and he is the knowledge itself. It is all one. This concept, the mouth does not have the ability to say, the ear does not have the ability to hear, and the human heart or mind does not have the ability to know it clearly or thoroughly. Okay, just to skip a little bit, and he says, therefore, God is not aware of the creations and does not know them because of the creations in the way that we know them, but rather he knows them because of himself. And therefore, because he knows himself, he knows everything because everything is contingent on him for its existence. So whereas a human being, the way that I know that this book exists is because the book exists, and then I come along and say, oh, here's the book. Now I've learned something. The book exists, right? But God knows everything from the inside out. He knows himself, and everything results from his existence, so therefore he knows everything. So that's the difference between, so for me, I am myself, and I go through the world as myself, and I pick up knowledge as I go, which means that knowledge was not me. It's, I bring it into myself. I absorb it. It's coming from outside of me. Okay, so Neil, since we raised it, we'll at least begin to talk about it. You are beginning to feel the discomfort of the issue of negating any kind of description from God, because as soon as we negate any kind of description from God, we run up against these kind of problems. We can't say anything about God, then what are we talking about? So the Rambam's track, if you will, is to nail down and to secure this idea that God cannot be compared to any other thing that exists. That God's existence is qualitatively different from anything else that exists, to the extent that we cannot talk about God by reference to anything else. Because to do otherwise would impinge on the concepts like God's unity. The Rambam also talks about this concept in the laws of tshuva, the laws of repentance. He's talking over there about the idea of free will, which is another major question, and I don't want to try to answer it now. Yeah, but the basic problem being that there are two basic problems that the Rambam tries to address. One being, how can a person defy God's will if God's will is determinative of everything that exists? Everything exists because of God's will. How can you do something that is against God's will? And a related question is, if God is omniscient, if he knows everything, then how do you have the free will to act? Does he know what you're going to do, or does he not know what you're going to do? The Rambam's answer can be highly unsatisfying. It was certainly for the Ravid, for Rabbi Avram ben David, who had many criticisms on the Rambam throughout his book, and this is one of the places where he strenuously criticizes him for raising a question, a logical question, and then not giving a logical answer. But what the Rambam says is that since God's knowledge is fundamentally different from our knowledge, and we cannot understand how God knows what he knows, then we can accept that God's knowledge doesn't conflict with our ability to choose. So, as the Ravid says, he raises a logical question, and then he returns it to faith, that you have to believe that despite the fact that you can't understand it, God's knowledge doesn't conflict with your ability to choose. Now, there are, I think there are ways of understanding the Rambam in a more something closer to logic, let's say. But that is another context where he brings up this idea that God does not know with a knowledge that is outside of himself, but rather he and his knowledge are one, and that no human being can comprehend this kind of okay. So now we'll just read it the way that the Alter Rebbe has it here, and he adds a couple of verses as well. He says that the Rambam writes, Shehu Hamada, that God is the knowledge, Hu Hayudea, he is the knower, Chula, and so forth. V'davar zeh, this matter, Ein b'cholat ha'adam lavino al buryo chulu. A human being does not have the capacity to understand it, to its profundity, to understand it fully. And then the Alter Rebbe quotes a couple of verses. He says, "Ketichtiv, as it is written in the book of Iyov, of Job, Ha'cheker Eloka Timtza." If you should try to plumb the depths of God, to fully investigate God, will you find Him? Will you be able to understand it? And it's written in the book of Yeshaya, Isaiah, "Ki lo machshavotai machshavotechem v'gomer." Your thoughts are not my thoughts. My thoughts are not your thoughts. In other words, we cannot hope to understand God's thoughts by reference to our own thoughts. His thoughts are completely different. Oh, very good. So that's exactly this question. Then there's no connection between me and God. Is exactly why there is the opposite impulse, especially among in Kabbalah, to make God closer to us. Not to make close to us by diminishing God, but to accentuate the ways that God relates and reciprocates and responds, to emphasize it, to highlight it. In other words, we have two directions that we can't fully ignore either of them. On the one hand, we can't diminish God by comparing him to ourselves and just saying that he's like us, only a lot bigger, a lot greater, a lot more. God is qualitatively different, a different kind of existence than us, and that's truth that we have to hold, and that relates to the idea of God being one. That relates to to some of the other concepts that the Rambam talks about at the very beginning of the Mishnah Torah. Understanding what God's what we mean when we talk about God's existence. So there is another side, and the other side is the fact that God did indeed give us commandments, and did enter into relationship with us, did enter into covenant with us, and we as well are seeking to have that relationship on our end, and that doesn't seem to be available. We just present God as this completely, this negative theology, this being that we can say nothing meaningful about. So, if I want to pray to God with feeling, I want to feel that God is here, God is listening, God is interested. So I'm saying we have these two sides, these two directions that are present at the same time. On the one hand, God transcends anything that we can define or describe, and on the other hand, there has to be some kind of relationship. But that's the premise of the entire Torah. Is that God cares? God cares about what we do. He cares about what's going on in our kitchen, right? If we're mixing meat and milk or whatever, He cares about when he listens when we pray. I'm not saying that He necessarily always gives us what we're asking for, but at least He's receiving our our prayers. And by the way, it doesn't make a difference if we're talking about a single human being, whether we're talking about an entire nation, or whether we're talking about the entire world, because all of that, there's no, none of that is closer to God's greatness, right? A million people or a billion people are not closer to God's greatness than one person. We're negating God from anything within our frame of reference. So, and yet at the same time, the same Torah that requires us to understand God in this transcendent way is also requiring of us to have a direct and an intimate relationship with God. And then when we look in the Talmud and we look in the Midrash, this becomes even more emphasized, because that's the way they talk about God. They talk about God in a very imminent, a very immediate way. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Chabad Hasidic approach. So there are different approaches, and different thinkers might opt to decide to put all their stock on one side of the scales rather than the other, because they feel that's the Rambam would say God is we can't describe God, we can't know God, we can only say negative things about, we can only negate from him any flaws, but we can't say any positive qualities from him. I say it contradicts. The flavor of it is not the flavor you find in the Talmud. The Rambam will tell you that's what the Talmud is saying. That's how he understands the Talmud. He addresses it. He says, if so, why does the Torah talk about God's eyes and God's hands and God's feet and whatever? So these are not forced. These are all, but they're not meant to be taken literally. When we talk about God, we can only talk about him in metaphorical terms, because we cannot say anything definitive about it, because we don't have the like you said, the mouth does not have the ability to articulate it, and the ear does not have the ability to hear it, and the heart does not have the ability to know it. Truly. Other thinkers might opt to say, it's more important that we talk about God's immediacy. Let's say, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but I think it would be fair to say that many of the Hasidic masters, the Jewish people need to have a conception of God and a relationship to God that is where they feel that God is with them. They're going through hard times. It's not easy being a Jew in Eastern Europe. It's a lot of poverty, and there's a lot of oppression, and for people to be able to carry on, they have to have a concept of God in which God is a father. He's right there. He cares about us. He's available to us when we call. So let's not become philosophers and talk about this transcendent God, because that's going to people are going to lose touch with Judaism, or they're going to give up hope, or whatever. So it's more important to focus on the immanence of God. So I would say that in the Chabad approach, there are both simultaneously, and the way that this is done is by talking about two levels of God's relationship to us. One is in an imminent and immediate way, and one is in a transcendent way. So that's what we're going to get to. So I want to talk a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, about some of the things that are discussed by the Alter Rebbe's grandson, which is the Tzemach Tzedek, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch, who discusses this section of Tanya and this gloss that we haven't yet gotten to. We will yet get to it. And this passage of the Rambam. So he says like this. So the issue is trying to talk about God as being without characteristics. In the Hebrew, it's called pashut betachlit hapshitut. Pashut means simple, or another way of translating pashut would be unclothed, meaning without any descriptions. Betachlit hapshitut, with the ultimate simplicity, the ultimate lack of any description. And he says that the philosophers were challenged, I assume he's talking about the Jewish philosophers, by the descriptions that we find ourselves compelled to use with regard to God, like talking about God as being wise or being knowing, that we find in the Torah. And if so, then there's something in addition to his being. There's wisdom. There's something. There's a bit of a description over here. So, and this is what prompted the Rambam to say this, to say that even though we talk about God as being wise, as being knowing, we have to understand and we have to emphasize that his wisdom or his knowledge is nothing like our knowledge, and we can't compare the two. He is the knower and the knowledge and the known altogether, and we are not. Our way of knowing is completely different from his way of knowing. That is what the Rambam is getting at. So Tzemach Tzedek then goes on to quote from the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Liva of Prague. He was famous rabbi. Unfortunately, he's most famous for having created a golem, having created a man of clay that he was through Kabbalistic and the Kabbalistic methods was able to bring to life. But he was a major Jewish thinker. Maybe in part, maybe he's partially to blame for the reason why the Rambam is not the final word on a lot of these things, because he has a big problem with this Rambam. He says as follows. He says these people, meaning the Rambam and his ilk, talk about God as if he's this disembodied mind. And so he's a mind that knows himself, and therefore he knows what's outside of himself. He says, even if we say that God and his mind are one, like the Rambam says, nevertheless, we're giving some kind of description to God. We're talking about God in terms of intellect. He is an intellect, not an intellect. Like intellect is it's a different kind of, but we're still talking about him in terms of intellect. Right? The idea of intellect is to know something, to know something accurately. But how can we categorize God in any kind of category? So if you call him intellect, then you're saying that he has some kind of classification. So he says we cannot talk about God's essence as being intellect. Because he says an interesting thing. He says if we look in the Torah and we want to know what is God, what does the Torah call God? So the Torah calls God, the name that the Torah gives God is the divine name Yud Kei Vav Kei. Right? What is that name? we don't really know how to pronounce it or exactly what it means, but it's related to being, to existence, right? The word to exist is lihiyot, haya, it was, hoveh, it is, yihiyeh, it will be. All of those are kind of smushed together into this one name, which means basically that what the Torah says about God's essence, about what God is existence. Doesn't define him in any way. It doesn't say that God is mind, that God is intellect. And he goes on to say, if we look at the way that the rabbis refer to God in the Talmud, they refer to him as Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. What do they say about him? That he is holy. What does it mean to be holy? Holy means something that is distinct from other things. He's apart. They don't define him. And it actually says in one of his comments on the Torah that this can actually go in two ways. It can mean something that's special and therefore it's set apart, and it can mean something that is terrible and repulsive and therefore it's set apart. We find the term used in both senses, but the connotation of the word kadosh, something being kadosh, is that it is set apart. That's what we mean by when we say something is holy. We mean that it's distinct from all other items, beings, or whatever, as being something that let's say somehow is special to God. So therefore, it is holy. But and we'll have more to say about holiness later in Tanya as well. The Alter Rebbe gives in chapter 6, he gives a definition for this as well. But this is what the Maharal is saying. What Rabbi Yehuda Liva of Prague is saying, that the Torah calls God Yud Kei Vav Kei, existence, being. The rabbis call God holy, set apart. They don't define him. They don't say he is this, or he's like this, or he is knowledge that is not knowledge, or whatever, or is one with him. They say he is holy. He is apart from all the things that we know. Yeah. So what the Tzemach Tzedek starts to say, so the issue that both the Rambam and the Maharal are struggling with is the issue of describing God. We find descriptions of God in the Torah. How do we deal with them? The Rambam's approach is to say that God and his wisdom are one, and therefore to call God wise is not really a description of him. The Maharal says talking about God as being wise is a description no matter what you say, and better to say that he's holy. And the way that the Tzemach Tzedek is going to approach this, which is following in the footsteps of his grandfather, is to say that it depends at what level we're talking about. There is God in his essence, that he is transcendent, but then there is the way in which God allows himself to be approached. He makes himself accessible. He makes himself somewhat, and this is where the 10 Sefirot come in, somehow relatable to us. He cannot be defined by these 10 Sefirot, but one of the things that the 10 Sefirot do is it's God lowering himself to be able to be somewhat within the realm of where we are, so that we're able to connect to him. Anyways, so this is where we'll leave things for today. Just to say that we have these two levels: the transcendent level and the immanent level, or the immediate level, and that although God is essentially inscrutable, but God lowers himself. God allows himself to become accessible, and that's so that even as we're talking about 10 Sefirot, we're not describing God himself, but we're also not talking about something that is other than God. We're talking about God, lowering himself down. It's to give a very human metaphor. You can imagine a great mind, a great scientist or whatever, who has a little kid at home who spent a day, doing the highest level of math in the lab, and then he comes home and he gets down on the floor and plays with blocks with his little kid. Does the kid understand his father's mind? No, but the father wants to find a way to be able to enter into the child's world, to do something that's meaningful for the child that will allow them to interact. Okay, well, we'll stop here for tonight. God willing, pick up next time.